Hey guys, welcome to my channel. I hope you're all doing very well. Now, the time has come. The time has come for me to make the video that I never ever wanted to make, guys. I can't believe I'm sitting here today recording this very video talking about something that I never thought would be an issue for my favorite franchise of all time. But alas, we can't hide this anymore. We can't sweep these issues under the carpet anymore. We have to address it head on. So it's time to sound the alarms. It's time to address the problems with phase 4 of the MCU. Now, I made a very similar video a couple of years back talking about the problems facing the DCEU as a franchise as a whole. And like I said, I never imagined that I would have to make a similar video for the MCU. But in that video, I really tried to highlight that this wasn't about me bashing the DCEU in any way, even though I am a self-proclaimed Marvel fan, okay, but I did want to give an honest analysis of the issues facing the franchise at the time, and perhaps give suggestions about, you know, where the franchise could go should it find solutions for those problems. And that's exactly what I'm going to be doing here today. And even though the bias kind of swings the other way because I am a fan of this franchise, many of you guys will know more than anything in the world what I'm a fan of is good content. What I'm a fan of is excellent quality content, okay? And so I really want this franchise to be steered back in the right direction, as I'm sure many of you guys do as well. So we're going to be addressing some of the issues that the franchise has stumbled across in its 4th phase. Now, you might be thinking, Jean, why are you making this video now? You know, we're about to get Black Panther. It's about to fix all of our problems, heal all of our wounds, pay off all of our student debts. Like, why are you making this video now? Just wait a week until Black Panther comes out and all will be good. Well, I wanted to make this video now because I didn't want to go into a video like this having seen Black Panther, which I anticipate to be phenomenal. I wanted to make sure that I had more of an unbiased perspective on the state of the MCU at the moment, coming off of She-Hulk, but enough time has passed since that TV show for me to kind of cool down a little bit. I didn't want to give you guys a video that was skewed towards the positive because I had come off of seeing Black Panther. I wanted to make sure that I did this video beforehand, and at the same time, you know, when I do get a chance to see Black Panther and of course review it as soon as I can, I'll be able to address whether or not I think that movie has helped with some of the issues that phase 4 has been having so far. So either way, I do think it makes sense for me to make this video before the movie comes out. Now, before we get into this very detailed and very reluctant analysis of the state of the MCU right now, as per usual, if you haven't already, please be sure to subscribe to my channel and make sure you turn on your notifications so that you can be told when I upload next. And also be sure to give this video a thumbs up if you enjoy this kind of content. It would really be appreciated and it would help the channel out. Now, without further ado, guys, let's get into the problems with phase 4 of the MCU. So first things first, when we're looking at the issues that the MCU is facing right now, we need to turn back the clock a little bit. We need to rewind time back to 2019 when this franchise was inarguably at its very peak. This was when, of course, we got, at the time, the highest grossing film of all time in Avengers Endgame, the culmination of 10 years of storytelling done right. That film was such an intricate balance of spectacle and storytelling done right. And at the core of it, we had these amazing characters that had become beloved by millions of people around the world. I mean, this film reached the peak of not just the MCU franchise, but franchise filmmaking as a whole. It was a moment. It was a cultural phenomenon, the likes of which we had never seen before. And so naturally, the only direction that the MCU could go after that high was down. The only way is down, guys, and unfortunately that's what we saw happen following the release of this film. Now, the decline didn't start immediately because, of course, following the release of Endgame, we did have the second Spider-Man movie, Spider-Man Far From Home, and that did really well at the box office. It was still coming up from that high of Endgame. Of course, it didn't reach those limits, but it was still a very well received sequel to the first Spider-Man. fan, and it gave us a bit of an insight into life within the MCU after Endgame, which people were eager to experience. But honestly, even with the success of Far From Home, we were starting to see some cracks in the wall when it came to this franchise, as many people felt that Endgame had been the perfect point to drop off. Okay, it was the perfect point at which they would depart from the fandom, having seen the combination of 10 years worth of storytelling and feeling satisfied enough to depart at that point. And that was the kind of risk with Endgame, is that not only did it kind of bring forth the peak of the franchise and the only real direction that the franchise could go in after that was down, but also there was the added fact that it wrapped up with such a satisfying ending for some of the most iconic characters in the franchise that a lot of people have felt that was the perfect time to jump off the bandwagon, and that they no longer needed to follow the franchise as avidly as they had previously. But I would say that the majority of the fandom, and indeed mainstream audiences that were interested in the MCU films to begin with, did decide to stick around even after Endgame, and they were more than happy to continue along this journey that Kevin Feige had forged for them. But then, of course, we had this huge, unpredictable, unprecedented element that came crashing on us all in the form of the pandemic. I mean, the panoramic, right? It threw a wrench in everyone's plans, including the MCU's. And even though there was always supposed to be a bit of a break between Far From Home and the next MCU project, that break became elongated to the point where it emphasized that feeling that the MCU had finished off at a good point and there was no point in revisiting the franchise. Because you had such a long wait, people felt like they could move on when it came to their fandom interests. But for those of us who did want to stick around even after Endgame, even after the pandemic, I do feel there was a lot of pressure for the first project out of the gate to really hit the nail on the head, to really bring the MCU back to the forefront with a bang. And that project ended up being WandaVision, despite the fact that the original plan was for Falcon and the Winter Soldier to be the very first Disney Plus Marvel show. WandaVision ended up taking that slot. And I do feel like that series, whilst flawed, did generate the buzz and the hype that was needed in order to make it feel like the MCU was back with a bang. But the problems started to arise when the episodes dropped on a weekly basis, and as the weeks went on, a lot of the Easter eggs and fan theories and all of the things that people were excited about discussing ended up leading to nothing. They were dead ends or red herrings on the show, which led to a lot of disappointment. And of course, we all know we all know about the Mephisto of it all. Okay, we're all clutching onto that Mephisto theory, me myself included. And I already made a video talking about, you know, the issues with WandaVision and the fan theories that came out of that show that you can go ahead and check out. But long story short, the problem with the series was that it was this big mystery that people were really invested in, to the point where people came up with theories and suggestions for what was going on that were far more interesting and far more elaborate than what the series presented us with. And it ended up being quite disappointing, and that, coupled with the fact that the season finale just ended up being another magical bash up that we've seen time and time again in third acts of superhero films, it led to a somewhat disappointing ending for the show that left a bad taste in people's mouths. And I would say that that was the first inkling that we got that something was off. Okay, something in the milk wasn't quite clean, which brings us to our first issue when it comes to phase 4 of the MCU, and that is the lack of direction / vision. Now, I've done a little bit of digging into this, but it pretty much confirmed what I already knew, which is that a large part of the MCU's success for the first 3 phases was the direction or the vision that each of the phases had. Each installment of this franchise felt like an unmissable event. Apparently, the previous phases of the MCU had actually been designed after the Civil War comics. Now, I don't read comics, as I often say on my channel, okay? But based off of the explanations that I've gotten, it's become clear that there was definitely some, you know, inspiration from the model of the Civil War comics, where you have these smaller stories acting as a launch pad for larger, greater events that would draw the audiences in. And in the case of the MCU, those great big events were the Avengers movies that acted as mini culminations of the overarching overarching storylines of the phases. With the huge success that the first Avengers movie was, of course there was added pressure to not only deliver to that same level, but increase expectations as time went on and as each Avengers movie was released. The franchise needed to keep upping the ante if it wanted audiences to be excited about each installment. So Avengers Age of Ultron had to be bigger and better than Avengers 1, and Civil War had to be bigger than Avengers 2, and of course Avengers 3 and 4 had to be huger than all of them combined. And once again, that's where the franchise reached its peak. That's where it had done everything that it could at that point to blow the audience's mind. And where do you go from there? And that's actually something that Marvel producer Richie Palmer discussed in an interview with Insider, where he said that Phase 4 of the MCU was all about reacting to the events of the Infinity War saga. It was all about seeing the fallout from the snapping and seeing how the characters, you know, reacted and how their lives had changed after those events. For example, I recently read an interview with Ryan Coogler, who talked about the original story for Black Panther 2 before the tragic passing of Chadwick Boseman, and he explained that that version of the film was supposed to explore T'Challa's reaction to the fact that he had lost 5 years of his life, and that is extremely significant considering that he is the ruler of Wakanda. You know, Wakanda was left without a king for 5 years, and he was supposed to come to terms with this and try and figure out the trajectory of his rule in light of this significant change. That was the direction that the original version of the film was supposed to go down, which is very much in line with what Richie Palmer said about the direction of Phase 4 overall. And whilst I think this was a compelling setup for this phase, the problem is that this is largely reactionary, and it contrasts to the proactive approach that we have seen previously in the franchise when it comes to the overarching stories of each phase. And it resulted in this phase being robbed of the narrative momentum that the previous phases benefited from. This is pretty much the difference between Spider-Man Homecoming and Spider-Man Far From Home, where Far From Home was very timely because it was released right after Endgame, so we wanted to see the impact of those events on the MCU characters. But to have that be the crux of your entire phase, I think would have gotten really old, and it has gotten pretty old, especially considering once again there was that massive pandemic that happened in real life, a real life world-changing event that people were actually experiencing, and that led to one, a delay in the franchise where all of the films were pushed forward an extra year, so we had to wait even longer to get our MCU fix, and two, people suffering from trauma and PTSD from a real life event that changed so many lives. And so did we really want to go back to this franchise having already been through shit and see a bunch of fictional characters having been through shit and dealing with the fallout from that? Not really. So it's unfortunate. There's a combination of these like narrative issues but also real life issues, which has led to the emotional core of Phase 4 of the MCU just being inadequate at this point. Not only that, but going back to the idea that Phase 4 has lacked vision and direction, even though it may have been their intent to explore the fallout from the Infinity War saga, I feel like each individual filmmaker has taken that and kind of turned it into whatever the hell they wanted, and I think that's also added to the feeling of there being a lack of direction, because a lot of these filmmakers have been injecting all sorts of Easter eggs and storylines from the comics and all sorts of things, you know, going back to the WandaVision problem, and they haven't necessarily kind of come together and coalesced into a coherent storyline that makes sense for audiences. For instance, as I've often complained, and I had a whole discussion about this in my Doctor Strange Multiverse of Madness review, but the issue of the multiverse, right? This idea that the multiverse would be introduced into Phase 4 of the MCU, I feel like it has been executed so poorly because filmmakers have decided to introduce it in all different types of way that don't really make sense when you put it all together. We had Wanda in WandaVision creating a hex where she controlled everyone's minds, and some of us thought that that might lead to the introduction of a multiverse multiverse there, with the appearance of Evan Peters' Quicksilver propelling that idea forward, but that turned out to be a dead end. And then we had Loki, which introduced the idea of multiple timelines and multiverses, and the multiverse kind of exploded at the end there, but that also led to a dead end because we didn't really see the fallout from that impacting any of the films, like for instance Spider-Man No Way Home, where it was a whole different thing that led to the multiverse erupting, and then fast forward onto Multiverse of Madness, where it was a whole different thing there. So all of these different Easter eggs, or references or suggestions for where the franchise could go, have been very disconnected within Phase 4 and has led to this phase feeling directionless. Another example of this is of course the X-Men. Speaking of Evan Peters as Quicksilver, okay, but the X-Men have also been another example of the direction of Phase 4 just being really unclear. Many of us thought that we would get hints towards the X-Men at this point of the franchise before properly introducing them in perhaps Phase 5 or 6. And we have in fact gotten those hints, okay? We have in fact gotten those suggestions of what may come, but they have just been so, again, disconnected and discombobulated and pointless that it hasn't made fans excited for the X-Men's return, but rather nervous about it, and nervous about how these characters may be treated within this franchise. The next issue when it comes to Phase 4 of the MCU is this massive question that a lot of people have started to ask themselves, and that is Kevin Feige spread too thin? This is a common question that I've heard people ask throughout Phase 4, especially now that we have 3 MCU movies come out each year, and of course we have the addition of the Marvel Disney Plus series, all of which are mainly produced by Kevin Feige. It's not like the old regime where you had other producers like Ike Perlmutter, for instance, producing the TV shows, with Kevin Feige only focusing on the films. Now he's in charge of all of it. He oversees everything, and people feel that is perhaps kind of wearing him down and leading to a lot of missteps. Now, I obviously can't speak to whether or not Kevin Feige is being worn thin over there at Marvel Studios. I obviously can't speak to the intricacies of his daily plans, again, how he interacts with the other producers in the studio. It is interesting that, we were so excited to see Kevin Feige taking over the TV show division so that both Marvel TV and Marvel movies would all feel unified under the same direction. We were really excited about, the TV shows being more connected to the films and kind of supporting the franchise in that way. But now Phase 4 has ended up being the most directionless phase of the MCU, which I find fascinating. And people have pointed to the sheer amount of projects that Kevin Feige has to oversee as a reason for the drop in quality of those projects. But I kind of disagree with this. I don't necessarily think that the sheer amount of projects coming out has led to the drop in quality. We're going to talk more about this when we go to, that category in the video, but I think there are more factors to it than just Kevin Feige overseeing too many projects. It depends on how he's managing these projects and who is working underneath him. Again, we'll talk about it later when we get into the quality section, but I did just want to slot in this reason for why Phase 4 of the MCU may not be going according to Kevin Feige's plan. But I'm linking this more to the third reason why Phase 4 is finding issues, and that is burnout from the MCU. As I mentioned before, a lot of audiences decided that they were going to jump off of the MCU bandwagon after Endgame. But it has to be said that another reason why a lot of people decided to move on from the franchise at that point was because of superhero fatigue. We've been hearing about this phrase for a very long time. Okay, people have been claiming to be superhero fatigued for a while now, but I do feel like in 2019, at the point of Endgame, where you feel like you've seen the superhero movies to end all superhero movies, and you're already starting to get a little bit tired of the same tropes popping up here, there, everywhere, I do think that superhero fatigue played a role in some people losing interest in continuing on with the MCU and perhaps wanted to dive into other genres or other franchises instead. Now, this is of course terrible, horrific news for Walt Disney Studios because Disney of course decided to launch their own streaming platform, Disney Plus, and they were heavily relying on Marvel to get audience audiences in because of their investment in this franchise. So hearing rumblings of superhero fatigue is the last thing that they wanted. Okay, and they were going to ignore, they were going to ignore all of that because they needed Marvel to pump out as much superhero content left, right and center as it possibly could. And so now you have an even bigger conundrum where not only are the 3 films that are being released each and every year seeming to be a little bit much for some audiences, but you also have these streaming shows that you want people to get invested in, and that is really starting to feel like overkill, to the point where even though these shows only started in 2021, literally a year and a half ago, now we're nearing the end of 2022 and it's already starting to feel like we had this 10+ year journey with the Marvel Disney Plus shows alone. It's just crazy to think about how excited loads of us were for the release of WandaVision, Falcon the Winter Soldier, Loki, but then how that excitement literally plummeted as time went on to the point where we're near the end of 2022. And honestly, I'm just kind of deflated. Like, honestly, I'm just kind of tired. If people weren't fatigued before, they sure are now. But my question is why? You know, why is it that so many of us already feel fatigued by the Marvel Disney Plus shows? Because here's the thing, Marvel has always had TV shows. Okay, Marvel has always had TV shows associated with the franchise. Remember the days of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., of Agent Carter, of Cloak and Dagger, The Runaways, the Marvel Netflix shows, and a whole host of animated series that were closely connected to the movie franchise. Like, Marvel has always had a whole bunch of TV shows operating concurrently with the film franchise. So why is it just now that we're starting to feel fatigued by the MCU when these Marvel Disney Plus shows have popped up? Because those previous shows had multiple seasons, hundreds of episodes that were all running concurrently with the movie franchise. What changed? This is my big question. Like, what actually happened? And I've been thinking about this, of course, because I wrote a script, right? I've been thinking about this, and I think the crux of the issue is that with the Marvel Disney Plus shows, we are promised a direct connection to the movie franchise. And this is by design. This is a marketing tactic to ensure that all of the remaining Marvel fans get Disney Plus so that they can stay on top with the storylines that are closely connected to the Marvel movies. That's what we've been promised from the very beginning. That's why the first 3 shows were, you know, exploring characters from the films like Wanda and Vision and Sam and Bucky and Loki. These are, you know, much loved characters that we've gotten to know on the big screen that we could further explore on the small screen. And that's what got audiences in. And I think that helped cast a wider net for these TV shows than any of the previous shows ever had. Like, how many Marvel fans were really checking out Agent Carter? How many Marvel fans were watching Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D.? That was a very successful show that had, what, 6 seasons? So it did very, very well, but it didn't cast as huge a net as it possibly could have if it was directly linked to the Marvel movies. And then we had that odd situation with the Marvel Netflix series. Excellent shows for the most part. There was definitely a step up in quality with the Netflix shows in comparison to the network shows, but this link that they were supposed to have with the films was always very tenuous and almost reluctant. You know, it was just like a little reminder that things were happening in the same realm, but the Marvel movies never wanted to make that connection to the Marvel Netflix shows themselves. Whereas over on Disney Plus, like I said, one of the major selling points of those Marvel shows is that they are so very directly linked, which means that we have a larger net to cast for audiences, which means that we have even more audiences trying to check out each and every one of the Marvel shows, as well as watching all 3 Marvel movies that come out every year. And I think that is what has led to a feeling of over fatigue of the Marvel franchise. Whereas with the old model of television that we got, each of these shows had smaller audiences, so people could check out, you know, Netflix's Daredevil without having to worry about The Runaways or, you know, Cloak and Dagger. I have never watched a single episode of Cloak and Dagger. Okay, I've never watched a single episode of Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D. Sorry, I never watched a single episode of Cloak and Dagger. I did actually check out the rest. Oh, Inhumans, also never watched, okay? And there was no pressure to, because they weren't linked to the film, so I wouldn't be out of sorts if I didn't check check those out and then want to go ahead and watch the latest Marvel film. So I guess it's ironic that the marketing team's decision to try and get people to stay on board with the franchise, both on the TV space and the movie space, has led to audiences kind of feeling deflated and not wanting to check anything out at all. Okay, so the next issue when it comes to phase 4 of the MCU is most definitely, hands down, the quality of programming. Now, remember when I said that I would get to this? Remember when I said that I would address this little issue? Yeah, here it is. This is a problem. Yep. This is a problem. But like I said, I don't think it's necessarily a problem because Kevin Feige is spread too thin. I'll explain why I think this is a problem. I think this is a problem because Disney has given Kevin Feige a mandate to pump out that MCU content left, right and center in order to bolster the streaming service, which they're very much invested in. And let me tell you, it has become very, very clear, especially looking at competitors like Netflix, okay, and Amazon Prime. Streaming services are a bottomless pit to throw your money into. They may be potentially extremely profitable, but you need to be willing to spend the dollars. You need to be willing to spend the cash, honey, in order to get that streaming service rolling, because you can't be cheap and have a streaming service. Just ask Warner Brothers. So Disney needed to be ready to put an intense amount of money into this streaming service, which it has. It absolutely has. But I don't think it has put enough money in there for all of the Marvel shows to feel like they're top tier entertainment, because some of these shows are looking a bit, not even Netflix, some of these shows are looking a bit CW, some of these shows are looking a bit Disney Channel. It's unfortunate and I'm sorry, but like you can definitely tell the difference between the budgets given to shows like Falcon and the Winter Soldier, WandaVision and Loki, which have more of a cinematic quality to them, versus a Miss Marvel and She-Hulk. You can see where the budget went. And even saying that, none of these series look like they had blank checks. Like none of these series look to the level of House of the Dragon. Even I just cussed out Warner Brothers and HBO. Listen, when HBO does have money, okay, to spend on a show, it will spend, honey. House of the Dragon looks miles better than the majority of these Marvel shows, which is crazy considering the MCU is a multi-billion-dollar franchise. But it just goes to show that even that amount of clout and money and profit will not be enough to sustain all of this content. You know, they need to get more money to pump into these shows to make them look high quality and really on the same level as the films. And speaking of the films, they're not off the hook either, okay? I've been talking a lot about the Disney Plus shows because I think that's the biggest shift when it comes to phase 3 versus phase 4 of the MCU. But the films have also encountered problems, and just sticking to the topic of money for a second here, I feel like ironically when it comes to the films, they have all the money in the world. You know, they're given $200 million budgets, but for some reason Hollywood has forgotten how to spend that money adequately, because these franchise films these days are looking ugly as sin. And I know that it's been a complaint for the longest time that Hollywood uses too much CG and blah 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 blah, but no, truly now truly now, okay, you could have a costume designer on set be like, I promise you, I studied costume design for 20 years, I went to the most prestigious university, I've been working with the most prestigious designer, I promise you sis, director, they're talking to the director, I promise you sis, I can design this actor the most amazing costume in the world. Like, I can do this, let me get the sewing machine out and do this for you. And the director would look that costume designer dead in the eye and be like, don't worry, we'll fix it in post. Like, why? Why is this happening? Guys, listen, I am not one of those film lovers that thinks that CG is the devil and technology is the end of days and blah blah blah, okay? I think there is a place, of course, for special effects, for CGI, for all of it. But I think it works best when it is used in tandem with physical sets and props and costumes, you know, like just the practical stuff. I think those two together make magic. And I think, you know, that's one of the reasons why, for instance, the first Iron Man movie looks so good, is because they actually built parts of the costume and they used CG to fill in the blanks. That's why it looks photorealistic. Whereas now, if Iron Man was made now, it has just gone so out of hand. I don't know what is going on. I feel like Hollywood needs to go back to the drawing board when it comes to its use of CG. Oh, and there's also the issue of the volume, this new technology that Hollywood is just like fumbling over. Literally, you can see them fumbling with films like Thor, Love and Thunder, and even the new Ant-Man movie looks like it used the volume quite a bit. Like the volume, I've already talked about the volume in my, my Obi-Wan review. I talked about my thoughts on the volume in a bit more detail, but this just goes back into the theme of CG and technology not being used in the most efficient way to make the best film possible, but rather to force the animators to fix everything that wasn't accomplished on set months afterwards. And that would have been all well and good. I mean, not for the animators. Not for the animators, obviously. For us audience members, it would have been fine, except now we're starting to see it. Oh, now we're starting to see it, love, okay? Things that used to be hidden are now in plain sight. Oh. Now, another issue when it comes to the quality of Marvel's Phase 4 projects is actually with the creative teams involved. I feel like Marvel has had several missteps with the creative teams, which is especially unfortunate considering that they're trying to hire more people of color and people from underrepresented cultures and backgrounds to work on these Marvel projects, and that is of course reflected in what we see on screen, you know. So not only do we have that shift behind the scenes, but also on screen with characters that have popped up in this phase being from underrepresented backgrounds. And I feel like the stakes are even higher with these characters to do them justice because of all of the obstacles against them, especially in this world that is so fueled with hate. So clearly Phase 4 is a very crucial time in the MCU when it comes to representation, but unfortunately there have been several creative teams that haven't been able to deliver the level of quality that we've come to accept from these projects, and it has reflected poorly on these characters of color or characters from underrepresented groups. But honestly, I don't wholly blame the creative teams from these projects, especially when it's, you know, people of color who have limited experience in the industry. They may have worked on a couple of projects previously, but they're still largely unknown. Marvel has been hiring those kinds of filmmakers for a minute now, but I think their inexperience is starting to show. And like I said, I don't blame them. This is a function of Hollywoodizing. Hollywooding? Like, what would I say? Hollywooding, I think. This is a function of Hollywood being Hollywood, okay? Because you have so many of these, you know, cisgendered white male directors and filmmakers who have been working in the industry for years and years. They have that experience that you need to make these stories work. But because Marvel is moving in a different direction when it comes to diversity and inclusion, they tend to get these filmmakers that are the new kids on the block and they have more limited experience. And unfortunately, introducing all of those changes at once throughout this phase has led to a large inconsistency in quality. But come to think of it, you know what would have really helped all of these filmmakers out? You know what would have really helped these writers, directors and showrunners? Is if maybe Kevin Feige had a clear direction for Phase 4. And that just goes to show that all of these different reasons and explanations that I'm going through in this video are all interconnected, okay? Don't forget that they don't each exist in a vacuum. They're all kind of combining together to affect the results of what we saw in the projects of Phase 4. And lastly, the final problem that I think Phase 4 has had is the fierce competition. Now, up until this point, I've been talking about Phase 4 of the MCU as if the franchise exists in some kind of vacuum. But of course that is not the case. Of course the MCU is only one franchise amongst a ton, not to mention the millions upon millions of hours of content across all different media, across all different platforms that we have nowadays. The competition for our attention, for our eyes or ears is fierce these days. It has never been greater. And so speaking of all of these issues being interconnected, this really was the worst possible time for the MCU to slip up, because guess what? We have better alternatives. If they're not going to deliver on the quality, if they're going to bombard us with a bunch of mid-feeling content, we have so many other alternatives to turn to for a better quality experience. But we can just narrow it down to just TV shows. Think of the millions upon billions of hours of TV show content that we get literally every week. I mean, we've already started to see the bygone era of the CW superhero shows fade out of fashion. But what has emerged is really high quality, engaging and unique types of superhero shows that audiences have flocked to. I mean, how can you possibly compare Invincible to What If? Like, I'm sorry, but if you gave me the choice between rewatching What If and rewatching Invincible, and so if we're being honest, if we're looking at it from an unbiased, critical point of view, we have to admit that some of these, MCU Disney Plus shows would not get the time of day if they were not associated with the biggest franchise in the world. Period. I'm so sorry. If She-Hulk had nothing to do with Marvel, nothing to do with the MCU whatsoever, I would have dropped that show in like episode 3. At the very most. So guys, we're approaching the end of the video that I never wanted to make. Although you wouldn't be able to tell considering how gleeful I look, right? I seem ready to roast the MCU. But this is killing me on the inside, I promise, okay? But we are nearing the end and I didn't want to end things off on a negative note. I did just want to suggest a few solutions to some of these issues that we've pointed out in the video. So first of all, even though it seems like a gloom and doom time for the MCU at the moment, with phase 4 looking like the worst point in the franchise, I think it's important to note that there have been low points in the franchise previously, like Iron Man 2, like Thor 2, some of these sequels weren't great, okay? But Kevin Feige never gave up. Kevin Feige took a look at the response after each of these films and course corrected where necessary. And I think that's a direction that's very much possible for this phase of the MCU as well. Now, this is somewhat paradoxical to what I was saying previously about the MCU needing a direction, because if you need to have a direction, it means you need to plan ahead for what's to come in the franchise, which also incidentally makes it quite difficult to course correct as projects are coming out and fan reactions are coming in. So that can be a bit of a challenge, but like I said, they've had to deal with this challenge previously before, so Kevin Feige is more than equipped to be able to handle the changes that need to be made for phase 5 and 6 to be better than phase 4. And also, speaking of phases 5 and 6, we're already starting to see Kevin Feige make those course corrections, with phase 4 ending off with Black Panther 2 instead of, I think, the Marvels, which was originally supposed to be the end of this phase. And I think at the very core of this is the necessity for phases 5 and 6 to have an exceptional villain. We need a good villain, for goodness sake. For badness sake, okay? We need a good villain. No more faffing around with these mediocre dead-ass villains. We need someone great. Now, on the bright side, I do think that phase 4 gave us, one positive little element, and that was the introduction of Kang. Okay, Kang, as portrayed by Jonathan Majors, is our shining light at the moment. We are putting all of our villainous hopes on him. It looks like they are going to be treating Kang as this new version of Thanos, and that's very exciting to me. I think Jonathan Majors as an actor is absolutely up for the challenge. He's such an amazing actor, and I think so far from what we have seen, it's looking like they're treating the character with that level of seriousness and dedication. We need to have the motive, we need to have the gravitas that we got with Thanos in Kang in order for this to work, because not only do we need to up the ante when it comes to the spectacle of Avengers 5 and 6, but we also need to up the ante when it comes to the character development and well-roundedness of the villain at the center of the Kang dynasty. So the stakes could not be higher when it comes to producing an excellent, exceptional villain that could possibly save the mishaps of phase 4 of the MCU. Another solution that I would propose in order to address the quality over quantity problem would be to make fewer Disney Plus shows. Sorry! Listen, at the end of the day, if Bob Chapek, okay, the head of Disney, is not going to give Kevin Feige the budget that he needs to produce top tier Marvel Disney Plus content, then they need to make less. That's it. That's the point blank period. They just need to make fewer shows, because this whole mid-budget, subpar quality thing that's going on here, the slurry of content that's going on, is not going to cut it. Like I said, these shows only started at the beginning of 2021. We're nearing the end of 2022. It is such a short-lived high from these shows. I'm sure Disney wanted a bit more bang for their buck when it came to the Marvel Disney Plus shows, but unfortunately they have not delivered in quality. So what do you want audiences to do? Like I said, there's a ton of competition out there. So I think it is pertinent for Kevin Feige to reduce the number of Disney Plus shows coming out per year. And for those that are released, they really need to get the love and dedication and budget poured into them. Okay, so that they can really thrive and push forward the franchise as opposed to holding it back. And also, I have to say, I understand that a lot of these Disney Plus shows, especially the ones that have come out in 2022, have been designed to introduce brand new characters into the franchise, like Moon Knight and She-Hulk and Miss Marvel. But if a character is not ready to be introduced, if a character is not ready to make their live action debut, how about we just put a pin in that? Like, how about we just put a pin on that character? I'm talking about She-Hulk. Like, I don't appreciate this whole gag that the show had about how expensive it is to realize She-Hulk as a character on a TV show. If you couldn't do it, then you shouldn't have. No one was begging you to make a She-Hulk show, unfortunately. No one was begging you to make that show. So, like, why didn't you just wait for the technology to be on that level? Just like James Cameron waited so long to make the sequel to Avatar. Like, why didn't you just bring that same energy and make sure the technology would have been ready for this character? Make sure that the budget would have been ready for this character, and the story and writing would have been ready for the introduction of this character. Why didn't you just wait? You didn't have to introduce her like this right now, because now you've left a very poor first impression in people's eyes. So that's it from me. Now that I've given you guys my analysis of the problems of phase 4 of the MCU, and perhaps some of the solutions that Kevin Feige could take on board to fix things, it's time for you guys to let me know what you thought of all of this, you know, down in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts on your analysis of this phase of the franchise that we all, I'm sure, love so much. But as per usual, please be sure to subscribe to catch new videos coming up, and give this video a thumbs up if you enjoyed this kind of content. Thank you guys so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.